coming. We are, as you all know, here today to review our friend Roger.
I don't want to.
Roger was many things, among many other things that we'll discuss over the next hour. Roger was a pretty big presence at this show every year. I think Windy City and Oakcon in Oklahoma were Roger's two favorite conventions every year. Roger passed away on December 6th of last year, and his sorely missed both as an extremely kind, supportive, and generous member of the community, a friend, and for his many contributions to fandom. Roger was a pioneer in the appreciation of EC Comics, notably through the groundbreaking fanzine Squatron, which he and his childhood friend Jerry Weiss began publishing as teenagers in the 60s. Roger continued to devote a huge part of his life to the study and collecting of comics and related horror and science fiction publications and art, conducting crucial research and interviews with innumerable Golden Age comics artists, as well as working alongside Jerry to organize Sotheby's comic book and comic art, science fiction art, and mad auctions during the 1990s. Roger also founded and served as a longtime editor for the Comic and Fantasy Amateur Press Association, the CFA-APA, an essential, early, and still ongoing source of information and documentation of original artwork. Notable books by Roger that should be on the shelves of every fan include studies on Wally Wood, Reed Crandall, Mac Rayboy, and Matt Fox. He also co-edited Jerry Weiss' monograph on Frank R. Paul. And the latest issue of Roger's EC Fanatic fanzine, his worthy successor to Squatron, is truly one of the finest issues of any fanzine ever published. Roger was close to everybody on this panel, as will be clear from our discussion. But what floored me before I knew him personally was how varied his many accomplishments were, and this still stands out to me as amazing. I first saw his name when I was a teenager as one of the most prominent fans and historians of EC, but his contributions were myriad. He was an incredible collector and archivist, a researcher, a writer, publisher, and just all-around lifer in this world that we all love so much. And that's what was hugely important to me to discover at a young age, realizing from all these projects that Roger worked on that it was possible to make a life for yourself out of this great culture. Everyone up here had a different personal relationship and connection with Roger. So I'd like each of them to speak a little bit to start us off, and then we'll have a conversation and welcome comments and questions from those of you in the audience, as I'm sure many of you had close relationships with him as well. Glenn Crane is one of the biggest longtime collectors of science fiction and comic art, and was a very close friend of Roger and his wife Terry. Grant Geisman is the preeminent EC and MAD scholar and worked with Roger on the last two issues of his EC Fanatic fanzine. Dr. Chris Boyko is also a big collector and had many dealings with both Roger and Jerry Weiss over the years, contributing to the EC Fanatic as well as editing projects for Jerry. Eisner Award winner and CFA-APA member Steve Smith is also a close friend and had a big connection with Roger over the artwork of Jack Davis. Len, would you like to start us off?
You bet. I met Roger basically through our mutual friend Jerry Weiss. And I think that goes for a lot of people. Jerry was just that outgoing go-getter, and he was all over the place. He was intense, and Roger was kind of just the opposite. And my involvement with EC Comics and collecting EC art really spurred Jerry Weiss to reach out and find me, because we didn't know each other. I got very involved in the Russ Cochran auctions, was buying a lot of EC art. And next thing I know, this guy from, the New York area, he was in Brooklyn at the time and eventually moved to Gloucester. But, I get this call from, I guess Jerry got my number probably from Russ Cochran. And Jerry and I became really close. Our collecting interests parallel. And we just really hit it off, became great friends. And then he introduced me to Roger. And Roger was kind of just the opposite. Laid back, easygoing, the nicest guy you'd ever want to meet. And Roger and I, the way we collected, Roger was always totally into the horror, aspect of EC. Well, even the monsters, the monster craze in the 60s, Aurora models. all of these kind of things. And I really focused on the EC science fiction. And so Roger and I could trade with each other, and we did often. You know, he was just so always kind and helpful. And I can't think of Roger without thinking of Jerry. They're inextricably linked. And I loved when Jerry told me how he came to meet Roger, you know, I was amazed. So they were both about 7 or 8 years older than I was. So in the early to mid-60s, there was this big monster craze all across America. So there was the Aurora monster models. Every city had, you know, a monster host, a horror host. The cinemas either on Friday night or Saturday night. And it was just super popular. And one of those aspects of that was the Warren publication Famous Monsters. And all this relates to how Jerry and Roger, they both lived in Wichita, and they did not know each other. But Forrest J. Ackerman was the editor of Famous Monsters, and he decided he was going to go cross-country, make this road trip, meeting all of these, you know, 8, 10, 12-year-old fans. And at the time, I was a father myself. So I was raising a 3-year-old and a 5-year-old. And I heard Jerry's telling me the story, and I couldn't believe it. You know, a grown man going cross-country to meet young boys. And it was like, you know, in the 80s, you know, we had the Adam thing in Florida. And there was a similar incident in San Antonio with Heidi. And these people, you know, these young children, you know, met their end. And it was like, there I was as a father, and Jerry's telling me this. And granted, it was another era, you know, the early 60s. So it's completely different. But I was like, this really happened, Jerry? And it did. He showed me pictures, you know, with Corey there. And it was hosted at Jerry's house. And one of the attendees was Roger Hill. They both lived in the same town. They shared the same interests in comic books, monsters, and they became lifelong friends. And it was amazing. You think of those two as almost a pair. And I was so fortunate to meet and get to know both of them. You know, they were just wonderful people. And, you know, that was how I met Roger. But everybody that knew Roger and Jerry was a comic collector, a comic art collector. And, you know, it's just, we had a shared interest. And, you know, Roger, when I really got serious into EC art collecting, you know, Roger would tell me how before every auction, he would drive to West Plains, which is where Russ Cochran was, and he would look over all the art, front and back, because he was collecting pictures of everything on the back, where the artists would do doodles and prelims and sketches. Roger wanted to grab all of those images. He eventually wanted to do a book, but I don't think that ever happened. But, you know, it was just fantastic. Roger's deep interest in all this material, finding the history of it, and it was just wonderful. And Roger, so because we weren't opposed to each other in collecting, we could kind of, you know, agree, compliment each other. And Roger was the funniest. I would get a call, because he would have already seen the art in the next auction. And so I'd get a call from Roger, and you never knew what Roger had in his collection. He was very, you know, closed-mouthed about what he had. And that was fine. That was his way of doing things. And so he'd call me up and say, okay, hey, Glenn, you know, the auction's coming up, and I want to get this Johnny Craig or this Graham Ingles. And you go and buy it, and then I'll trade you, you know, Weird Science, number 12, the cover by Wally Wood. And sure enough, I would do that. And so we had this very great relationship, and it was just, you know, fantastic. And so it went on like that for years. And we all had a great time collecting that art. And one of the stories I really want to relate, and I call him Richard Evans, big collector down in Houston. And this was not one of the Russ Cochran deals. This was a separate thing that Roger had set up. And he calls me up and says, hey, I want to drive down to your house. We'll stay the night. The next morning, we're going to drive to Houston and do this deal. I'm selling Richard Evans' piece of art. Well, it was a cover to Haunted Fair 18. And the price was kind of eye-popping. And I have permission to talk about it. It was $100,000. And so we drive to Houston. And Richard, by the way, owned 5 comic book stores in Houston. And we get to his comic store about an hour early. We're just killing time, talking with Richard. He's a great guy. And we're waiting for, I guess you call him the money man. So Richard needed to get a loan from one of his buddies who owned business in Houston. It was a Shipley's Donut Company. Great donuts. Good product. So there we are, waiting for this man to show up. And so next thing we know, a guy dressed in full whites, head to toe, and like a baker's cap on, and he comes in bearing a Shipley's donut box, and it's filled with $100 bills. And Roger and I, this was a surreal experience. Roger and I were sitting there wondering who this guy is because he held us up officially. And we're just, like, wow, who is this guy? But anyway, so he ran his business Monday through Saturday. No, I talked to Richard. It's fine. Anyway, he ran his business. Yeah, I'm being, But Monday through Saturday, all his sales in his stores were on books. Sunday was off books. So
they'll be recorded.
Yeah.
There's no IRS agent.
No. And so he shows up with this, donut dozen box full of money, and Roger and I are just rolling. And it was just one of the deals that I will never forget. It was, Richard got a fantastic piece of art. Roger got the money, he puts it in his briefcase, and we drive back to San Antonio. And it was just a surreal experience, and I totally enjoyed it. And that was just one example of kind of things that we do in this hobby. Yeah. No, that's none at all.
Just dough.
Yeah, a lot of dough. But there's so many more things I could talk about. But I feel I should probably let some other people speak.
Sure, Grant. Thank you, Glenn.
You bet.
Yeah, Glenn. How about a hand for Glenn? Well, like Todd, I first saw the name Roger Hill when I ordered 2 copies of Squatron #2 in 1968, directly from Jerry Weiss. But I don't think I met Roger until around 1991, also through Jerry Weiss, like many people here. And that was in connection with the first Sotheby's comic auction that they had in New York. And, Roger, we had the same interests, obviously, and over the years, I bought a lot of stuff from him. We did some trading, nothing like, these kind of stories, but we always kept in touch, and if something popped up that was interesting EC-wise, I would usually email him, and, so we had that kind of relationship. I bought stuff from him, we traded now and then, and so we kept in touch, and I guess about a year and a half ago, I emailed Roger about something or other, and he emailed me back, with a reply, and then he kind of went on to say, well, I have to tell you that I've been diagnosed with stage 4 cancer, and it doesn't look very good, and I was, shocked to see this, obviously. But at the end of his email, he said, would you be interested in helping lay out another issue of his EC Fan Edit fanzine? And I said, of course, I will be happy to do anything you want me to do. Until then, Roger and I were pretty much on different creative tracks. He kind of did his book projects and fanzines, and I kind of did mine. The first time I ever got to work on anything of Roger's was through the last issue of John Benson's Squatron, which was issue 14. And Roger had written an article about this kind of old witch prototype that was in Yellow Jacket comics in the mid-40s. So I laid out that piece for Roger in that fanzine. And I think because of that, he asked me if I'd help, with another issue of EC Fanatic. So I said, absolutely. And he started sending me articles, and little by little I started laying it out. And the thing about Roger, the EC Fanatic fanzine in his mind was a true fanzine in all aspects. Meaning he liked that kind of made on the kitchen table, pasted up look, like kind of semi-professional kind of look. And then when he asked me to come on board, I wanted to up the production values a little bit, and also I wanted Gary Groff of Fantagraphics to publish it for us. And I kind of pitched, well, I respect your ethos about, having a homegrown look, but I think we kind of have to kick it up a couple notches. But Gary Groff was happy to publish it, so that first issue of EC Fanatic fanzine that I worked on came out last September. And we turned that into the publisher, and Roger said, well, do you want to jump on another issue because I have more stuff? And I'm like, yeah, let's do it. And so we have another issue coming out in June, and this is the new issue. This is the one of, I think, about 3 copies that exist in the United States. The rest of them are coming on literally a slow boat from China. And then, right before Roger passed, his wife Terry sent me a big box of stuff that is kind of the makings of another issue. So I want to put yet another issue of that fanzine together with that material.
It's amazing that Roger was continuing to work, even after he knew he was sick. He was so passionate about all this material, but yeah.
And I'm really lucky because putting these 2 issues together, I got to talk to Roger all the time on the phone. And it was just a special thing for me to be able to talk to him so much. And I have to say, even I would call up and I'd go, hey Roger, how you doing today? And he'd say, I'm not doing too good today. But then you get him talking about EC comics or artwork, and he would just brighten right up. It was not ill. He would just, the old Roger would pop right out, and it was so great to have that, And he was even, he never stopped being Roger. We did a trade of some stuff about 3 weeks before he passed. He was still, wheeling and dealing right to the end. And he was just a fantastic person, and I really miss him. And the other thing I have to say is, I guess it looks like I'm going to help get his Johnny Craig book that he's been working on for many years, help to get that across the finish line. And he asked me not to do this, but Johnny Craig's son, Stephen Craig, is here tonight, right over there. Anyway, thank you.
Thanks,
Chris Boyko.
I got my own microphone. I think we're going in order from how long we knew Roger, starting with, right? I think it's in numerical order.
I never met him.
Plausible deniability.
What are we talking about?
Yeah, exactly. So I think I met Roger, so many through the conduit that was Jerry, because Jerry had his little weaselly tentacles in every part of fandom. And I'm pretty sure I met Roger right at the tail end of the Sotheby's auctions when I finally got up the nerve to talk to Jerry and tell him that his catalogs were beautiful, but they could use some editing. And Jerry said, well, we're kind of not doing this anymore, but I'm doing a price guide. And then from there, once Jerry got to trust me, he would introduce me to other people, including people who were sitting all in this direction on the panel. So Jerry was sort of the gateway drug, if you will, to Roger, which sounds weird. But then we're talking about, cash in a donut box, so maybe it's not that weird. And, I knew who Roger was, of course, but again, he was sort of this mythical, creature from the 60s who did fanzines way before I would ever think of doing anything like that. And then at some point, you got a good enough relationship where you get a call that says, hey, Chris, I'm coming to Long Island, and can I stay with you? And I'm thinking, Roger Hill wants to stay at my house. Cool. And that was great because, as has been pointed out, when you got Roger going, he did not stop talking about the stuff he loved. So I had the weird experience of Roger staying at my house on Long Island and having Jerry previously, Jerry passed in 2011, incredible difference between Roger and Jerry. They symbiotic, and they work together fantastically, and they really love the same stuff. But Roger would stay at your house and get up and go, I had a great night's sleep, and let's go out there and look for Graham Ingles' house on Long Island. And we do that for hours, trying to find this house. It didn't exist anymore, but Roger knew where it used to be. So here's a plot of land where Graham Ingles' house used to be. And Roger was, always up. Jared would get up and go like, that bed sucked. And just complain bitterly about it. Because Jared and Roger were complete opposites in many ways, despite the fact they loved the same stuff. Jared was wound so tight, and Roger was so loose. And I said before at Roger's Memorial, Jared was like the anti-Wichita. He was like a New Yorker who happened to be born in Wichita. But both of them were really fun to be around. And it didn't matter that they had very different personalities. They were fantastically fun to be around. You would learn stuff, particularly from Roger, who was a literal encyclopedia of knowledge. And not just in one area. I mean, there's some people who just collect one kind of thing and they know a lot about it. But he knew stuff about all kinds of stuff. He could talk to you about science fiction art. He could talk to you about comic strip art. He could talk to you about comic books. He could talk to you about science fiction books. He could talk to you about pulp magazines. He could talk to you about, what am I missing?
Dancing with the Stars.
He did. He collected all those things. He collected a whole monster magazines. I'm sure can't forget that. Movie posters, absolutely. And here's the thing that really, really impressed me. He could tell you about the great-great-grandniece of this artist who worked on this one comic back in 1948 because he talked to them and interviewed them and saved that information. He cared about the history more than anybody I've ever met. An unbelievable amount of knowledge that he absorbed from people who were actually there in the trenches doing the work and from their descendants.
How would he find these people?
He would do the most amazing, complicated research that would take him months and months of struggling, calling random people on the phone. Are you so-and-so? No? Sorry. And then he'd call somebody else with the same name that he thought might be that person. And he would just keep going and keep going and keep going until he found the right person or their descendant. And odds are, how many ever times did he get to a person who was the kid or the grandkid of this artist or writer, and they'd give him stuff. Oh, take this box of, our archives that we don't really care about. He'd be like, oh. And he wouldn't take it and sell it. He would take it and put it in his files. And he'd turn it into research material for another article, or in several cases, books. So he was an incredibly dedicated researcher, and I'm a scientist, so I could totally get behind that. And he really cared. He wasn't in it for the money. He was in it for the research, for just answering questions he was super interested in, and for finding stuff out. He was a seeker of knowledge, and that is what impressed me most about Roger. Plus, he was an incredibly nice guy, and I have never met a single person who ever said anything bad about Roger. Ever. Jerry, well. But Roger, no. Right? Anybody here know Jerry from way back when? Okay, yeah, okay. So Jerry could be challenging sometimes, but Roger was never that way. Roger was the most affable, genial, laid-back, friendly guy you could ever want to hang out with, and I am really unhappy that I don't get to hang out with him anymore. That was a real tragedy.
Well, I don't have, or at least until the guys were talking, I thought I really didn't have a lot to offer, but it sounds like almost all of us had the same introduction to Roger, and that was just him reaching out and being friendly. I used to publish a magazine in the 90s called Monster Scene. It was a very popular horror film magazine. And it just occurred to me, I had told you earlier about how Jerry reached out to me to ask if I had any back issues, that he was missing a few copies. It occurred to me that not long after that is when Roger reached out to me to see if I had any of a certain issue. And now in my case, both guys traded me above and beyond what I gave them. But I had been on the waiting list to join the CFA APA for several years because my attorney friend Dave Applegate was involved, my friend George Hagenauer was involved, Gary Land, who I didn't know until I joined the APA, Gary, but I remember him. I got to join right before the Jack Davis issue came out. I never got a copy of it because they had already mailed them, so I started with the next issue. But because of Windy City, we used to have a party at my house, which when we lived here was only about a mile away. And so George recommended one time that we have a party for the APA members. And Roger and I had already been in touch because I was fortunate to live in a town that had a hobby shop in the late 70s owned by a guy who was a comic fan. And so he was one of the early direct comic market dealers. And so I was able to get issues of Squatron when I was in high school and learn about some of the artists who came before the comic artists of DC and Marvel era that I liked so much. I always gravitated towards horror comics, but I knew Bernie Wrightson and some of the other guys, not knowing until I read Squatron that really that was the second generation, and there were all these amazing artists before that in EC. So I was exposed to this early on, but I didn't know a lot about it. I knew movie monsters, and I loved them. So Roger and I developed an online correspondence because of the APA and the connection that I had published this magazine and he had published Squatron, or he and Jerry had done Squatron together. My first party that I had, Roger and Terry were there, and he walked in my house and saw my Jack Davis artwork of the 6-foot Frankenstein poster that I had commissioned Jack to do in 1990 when I was publishing the magazine. I wanted to do a color version of the original 6-foot poster. And obviously Roger owned the original black and white artwork for the black and white poster. And I've shared this with the guys, and I think I've shared it with Terry this weekend. My recollection of that party, that night in particular, is Roger wanted to have a picture taken with it, but then before he left, he said, "Okay, Steve, I need you to get a measuring tape, and I want you to measure the size of the figure, the width of the arms. I need all of the dimensions." And he just needed it for research. So I emailed him that later, and we've talked about how secretive Roger was about things. He said, "This is really nice. Can you send me a high-res scan of this?" And I said, "Of course I can." And I said, "Hey, by the way, can you send me a high-res scan of the black and white poster?" I'm really trying to keep a lock and key on that. Anyway, I've already sent my part. But that was the beginning of a friendship based on just mutual admiration for Jack Davis. We loved Jack Davis Frankenstein. And one day I got an email from Roger and he said, "Steve, you'll never guess what I got." I got in touch with a child of a record executive who had the Dracula's Greatest Hits artwork, which was all Jack Davis art. And the thing about Roger that everyone will agree with, he wasn't calling to say, "Look what I got and you didn't." He was like, "Look what I was able to salvage. We've saved another piece of history." And that's what mattered to him more than anything. And I just absolutely cherish those memories because he taught me so much by just what he wrote in Squatron and then in EC Fan Addict. Because as a fan, I always wanted to know more. But getting to know him, and everyone has already said, he would talk about it for hours. And last August, he called me, and I knew he wasn't feeling good, but I didn't know the severity of the situation. But he said, "It would be really cool if we really buckled down sometime soon and do that Jack Davis Frankenstein book. But I'm still working on this, and this. So when I'm finished, we'll talk about it." And that was exciting. It would have been great. And he kept gathering artwork for it, just because I'm sure he had 100 books that he wanted to do. I just will always remember what a good man, a good, honest man he was, and friendly and kind. There's a story of that same first party. My wife, Chris, is the best host, most hospitable person, and allowed all my friends over. But that night, I was looking at my dining room table with probably $1 million worth of EC art from various owners, and this glass of water that was at the edge of the table. And I was like, we've got to get that water off the table. He said, don't worry about it. And he got it. And I thought, of all people, I would have thought he'd be the one to be concerned, except for he would know how to restore something. But those are some of the greatest memories I have of Roger, is just getting to hang out with him. And every year before Windy City, he would let me know that they were going to be here and that he and Terry were coming to the party. And it was something I looked so forward to. I don't know if Doug Ellis is in the room right now or not, but I'm thankful to Doug and Deb for putting on the show, because I don't know if I would have ever had a chance to meet Roger in person without this show. And to actually meet any of you guys, because I met Glenn and Suzanne at my house, and Fred, and it's awesome. And this is the part of fandom that I think is so great. I will stop talking. I told you, Todd, that I keep going. And my wife even told Chris to nudge me, and you just fine.
That's great. Thank you. I just have a few questions. Grant, do you feel like working with Roger, you got a different sense of him, or a deeper sense of him in terms of not only his approach to all this material, how he put things together, and what he valued, basically sort of his approach to all this, or a deeper understanding of him as a person?
Well, what comes through is he just loved all this stuff to death, like, beyond love, really. It's hard to describe it. And the other thing that he sort of alluded to it too, it seemed to be like an endless supply of articles that he wanted to write and present, in fanzines and stuff. And I think, if he was still with us, he'd still be pushing forward, just like he was still wheeling and dealing, right to the end.
And buying.
Yeah, that's
buying stuff.
Well, isn't that wheeling and dealing? Well, wheeling, dealing, and buying.
That was one of the things that amazed me most about him, over the years, is his interest seemed to be just, you couldn't exhaust it. A lot of people get into fandom, and at some points in their lives they kind of drift out. Maybe they drift back in, but Roger seemed that's what meant so much.
He never stopped.
Yeah, never stopped.
But the other thing is, you never knew what Roger had or didn't have.
Yeah.
You might find out he had a couple little things, but you had no idea what was in. And he would sit on things. Like in this issue, Frederick Wortham, who wrote the infamous book Seduction of the Innocent, that kind of brought the comics industry to its knees. In 1967, Wortham was going around publicizing this new book of his called A Sign for Cain. But he was still ranting about anti-comics kind of stuff. And Roger found out that Wortham was on this guy Alan Burke's TV show. It was a TV interview. And Roger got his reel-to-reel tape recorder out in 1967 and tape recorded the whole show, which he sat on until right now, because it's now transcribed in this issue. So, you never knew what he was sitting on. You had no idea. Yeah. He was a character.
Glenn, what do you think Roger likes so much about this show in particular? I think you and I have talked about this quite a bit, but I think it's kind of telling that why a show like Windy City and as I mentioned, Pulp meant so much to Roger.
Well, I think we've all been out to, of course, shows like this when we were much younger. My exposure, first in Vincent, was Houston Town back in the early to mid-'70s. And the shows at that time were all about comics and comic art. And that's where you met people like Russ Cochran, Bruce Hamilton. And it was truly a comic show. And they evolved as it all became more pop culture and the Marvel movies. It turned into this giant monster, and San Diego Comic-Con was just no longer any fun to go to. But what remains after all these decades, you've got Windy City and Oakcon, as you mentioned, and they're throwback conventions to a much better time for our hobby. And the people are generous and kind and friendly. It isn't, packed, shoulder to shoulder, where it takes you an hour to get across the convention hall. And these are just the shows where you find all the best material, the best people. And Roger loved it, and he wouldn't miss it if he could help it. And I feel the same way. I've gone to so many San Diego Comic-Cons, used to adore it before it. They expanded the convention center, and then they doubled it, and the attendance went up to like 150,000. It became impossible to get tickets, and this show was just the best of everything. I mean, and Doug, he's not in here, but he and John, resurrected something that was missing from our hobby, and I'm eternally grateful.
When I picture Roger at this show in particular, it's always me at the end of an aisle, and I see him, halfway up an aisle, and there's always about 5 or 6 people sort of around him in a semicircle, listening to him, asking him questions, and him kind of holding court, and I always got the sense that people would, think up questions and have them for 6 months before the show. I can't wait till I see Roger. I'm going to ask him about this. And I was the same way. Have a list of things. Roger's the only guy that's going to know, about whatever obscure thing. I wonder if all of you or any of you want to talk about some of the specific artists that he was most passionate about. Not only comic artists, but he was heavily into obviously horror art. In sort of all sorts of forms, but also science fiction art too.
Yeah, my first inclination to respond to that would be Wally Wood, and that was my passion. I tried to get every Wally Wood cover and story that I could, and Roger loved and adored his work. And Wally Wood was a bit of a tragic story, but such a fantastic artist. He had his demons, smoking and alcohol. He drove himself, to the bitter end. But his artwork was fantastic. I know Roger was super passionate about it, as was I. And, I can't think of a finer example for my own taste, because I love the science fiction. And Wally Wood just exemplified that. And I know that was a passion of Roger's. For sure.
And of course, he did write the book, right? So Wally Wood
Literally wrote the book.
Yeah.
Literally wrote the book. Absolutely. And then we can talk about Graham Ingalls briefly, because not only was he crazy enough to go looking for Graham Ingalls' house on Long Island, doesn't exist anymore, but I think he really, not only liked Graham Ingalls as an artist, but he liked the mystery, because Graham Ingalls is the guy who disappeared one day, left his family and vanished, and Roger just loved that kind of a story where it wasn't just, lived in Levittown, had 2 kids, grew old, and died of old age. It was, this guy vanished. And the whole, where did he go? And of course, in the 60s, when Squatron was getting off the ground, this was still kind of a mystery about what happened to this guy. So I really piqued his interest. So he really did love Ingalls for an artist and for a personal, convoluted, and kind of tragic story in some ways.
I think in a general sense, he was not only a huge fan of these particular artists as artists, he really seemed to me to genuinely care about them as human beings. He was so interested in finding out everything he could about their lives and if possible, befriending these artists. And not only was he interviewing artists for projects that he was working on, he helped a lot of artists, a great deal.
Yes.
He would help
And their families, in many cases.
That's right.
Yeah,
Which is amazing. I mean, it's
And never did I sense that he ever did this because, I think I can make a buy.
Yeah.
It was all, that was like, as I said, people gave him stuff, he just gave him stuff. And he kept it. It wasn't like he was flipping it or looking for a cash payout. He was genuinely interested in that.
Amazing.
I'll add one little footnote about Wally Wood and, of course, Roger. Just like you, Brent, very close to the end, 2 or 3 weeks before Roger passed. And my phone calls with Roger had become less and less frequent because he wasn't feeling good. And he just didn't want to talk. He was getting weak. And so never in a million years would I have bothered him. But I got a call from Roger one day, and he said, "Hey, Glenn, I know you got that Avon inside front cover by Wally Wood. It was still one of their war titles. And he said, I'd like to do a trade with you." And I was astounded that he called me because I knew he was hurt. But he was so close to the end. He was still passionate. He wanted this Bollywood piece. And right when he said that, I had already decided that no matter what he offered me in trade, I was just going to take it. And because I wanted him to have that great feeling of getting something, that he loved one last time. And so he sent me a beautiful Lawrence Stevens black and white and a little Galaxy cover painting. And I was delighted, and he was happy. And within a couple of weeks, it was gone. And his passion lasted right up until the end.
And just a time to Jerry, one more time. Jerry also, when he was very sick, was doing deals to buy an entire warehouse full of comics and pulps because he couldn't stop himself. He's really sick. He's in the hospital. He's in the doctor's office, and he's like, when can we close this deal on this warehouse full of stuff? So Roger and Jerry both, they were optimistic that they would keep going and keep doing this, and it kept them going.
Yeah,
and that's
right.
super important. They didn't give up.
That's right.
They just kept cranking, which is important.
Does anybody have any questions for anybody? Yeah, a lot. That's what I was hoping. Yeah, this is great.
Just an observation from looking at the photos. First of all, Steve, I note that he wore a T-shirt that had your Frankenstein on it, so he put your scan to good use, apparently. But whose drawing board is he in? Sitting at some of those photos. I have a guess, but I'm curious.
There's two drawing boards in the photos.
Okay.
One is Wally Wood's. That's the one he's sitting at. And the other one where he's shaking hands with Louis Cassell, that's Don Heck's drawing board.
Oh, really?
That he got from Don Heck's nephew and didn't give to Dewey, but made a deal to trade with him or something.
Yeah, and Jim, to comment on the T-shirt that he's wearing, that was actually done. The Jack Davis Foundation or estate actually asked permission to make T-shirts of that when they had a Jack Davis exhibition in Atlanta. So that was done for the Davis family.
Who was the person that actually found Graham Ingalls? Was it Roger, or when he turned up and was studying?
I think it was Bill Spicer. I think
That might be right. Yeah, I think that sounds right.
he published Fantasy Illustrated and Graphic Story magazine in the 60s.
But was it in conjunction with Russ in the 80s? What Russ wanted to get artwork?
I'm not sure. I think he might have.
I think he was already found at that point.
I think Gaines finally found out where Ingalls was, and he somehow passed the address on to Bill Spicer, who sent a letter, wanting to interview Ingalls, and Ingalls wrote. He never responded to Bill Spicer, but he wrote to Gaines. I don't want any inquiries from fans. I'm not really here. Whatever, and I refer everything to my attorney, and don't. He did not want to know about fans until later in Ingalls' life, where Russ Cochran finally talked him into doing some new paintings of the Old Witch around '89 and '90. So. Probably because Ingalls, Cochran told Ingalls what the paintings might sell for, and that kind of got his attention. So he did 4 little ones, kind of prelim kind of paintings, and 4 big paintings of the Old Witch.
Roger had a few of those.
Yeah, he did. I got one from Roger over the years. But what I was going to say is, Roger happened to be at Russ Cochran's office. And they were expecting that they were going to call Ingalls and talk to him about these paintings. But a call came in, and Cochran's secretary said, Graham Ingalls is on the line. And Roger's like, and he brought a tape recorder so he could tape record the conversation. And he tells the story. He's running around in Russ's office, which was in an old house in West Plains, or used to be a newspaper office. And there were no outlets nearby, close enough, he didn't have an extension cord. So he's running around, and the conversation is going on. So he grabs a legal pad, and as fast as he can write, he's transcribing what the conversation is. And I don't want to bring this up again, but we have the full conversation in this
Available in the lobby next
week. I'm not trying to sell. I'm just saying. Roger was there for so many unbelievable historical moments.
It started with Roger and Jerry when they were kids. Bill Gaines. Those are my favorite photographs that we have in the roll here. Is seeing those two as little kids, particularly the one of Roger and Bill Gaines, this kid from Wichita, on Bill Gaines' balcony overlooking New York City.
And at that time, really, Jerry Weiss and Roger Hill were among the first kind of second generation fans to contact Bill and say how great the EC comics were. And Bill was very receptive to this, And really, most publishers would be like, throw these high school kids out of here. But Bill, he welcomed them, and they became great friends. And it's really also a testament to Bill Gaines.
It is. It says a lot about him.
Yeah.
Steve Korshak?
Yeah, I was lucky enough to have Roger and Jerry both contribute to the Frank R. Paul book that I worked on together. Did a great job. Really made the book. I was kind of curious. We talked about the two of them in Squatron. What about the role of Bob Barrett in Squatron? We didn't really talk about it.
It's a really good question because my view was always that Bob Barrett was kind of a mentor to both of those kids in some respect. Anybody want to talk about that specifically?
I mean, that's always, they both spoke very highly of him. And they both, Roger talked about it a lot, for sure. And because he was kind of like this is a terrible metaphor. I was going to say he's like the Roy Crankle to Al Williamson. That's not right, but he was like the older, guy who had been doing this longer. So he knew more about some of the stuff that they were really excited about. So I think they probably picked his brain a lot.
Did they work together?
Bob Barrett wrote for Squatron.
He contributed.
No, I mean, did they, the professional, was Bob Barrett an engineer?
And they worked at Boeing.
Yeah, is it Boeing?
It's
Yeah.
Boeing.
Before the doors started falling off things.
It was better when he was there.
That's right.
I think Jerry and Roger were lucky growing up in Wichita because they met when they were teenagers. A guy like Bob Barrett, and also Reed Crandall was in Wichita.
Amazing.
So it's amazing all of these things that went into sort of forming their lives. For the rest of their lives, what they were interested in at that age and got exposed to and learned about. Yeah, they kept. It was part of their lives. George.
Here's a rather interesting story. Sometime in the 1980s, I was at Pulp's comic book store, and he basically said, "Oh, you need to talk to Vince O'Neill, who's a comic art collector. He used to live in Chicago from Florida." So I called Vince up and said, "There's this guy. He's got an ad in the price guide. He has 300 different artists. I'm sitting here with a Lou Fine National cover." Okay. It was Mark Landis. So basically, he gave me the phone number and I called him. If Vince hadn't said he had a Lou Fine cover in his hand, he would not have gone anywhere. And this guy was really quite wacky. So you spend an hour on the phone with him, another hour on the phone. About 2 weeks later, you finally score a trade because it only trade. It would not take cash. So you had to work out a trade with this guy and spend hours on the phone with you. So we worked out this trade deal on this Mail and St. John Details cover. About 2 days later, this guy is totally focused on Houdini and magic. 2 days later, I get a phone call from Roger. He says, "Hey, George, you got any Houdini stuff?" I said, "You're talking to Mark Landis, right?" "Yeah." I said, so we got into talking, and we said, well, one, this guy not only has 300 artists, everybody you ever wanted, Frank Frazetta, people you never heard about, Jack Cole covers, but, he's got multiple copies. He's got 8 or 12 new Fine covers from the Golden Age.
How is this possible?
We decided that we probably should coordinate things and get all the people together and do original artwork because it took, 4 hours on the phone with this last job to get one piece. You'd be spending hours and hours if we had 2 people going after the same piece. So we basically contacted everybody and kept flowing information back and forth on the phone. Who was going after the ones who didn't have people. Well, about a month and a half, 2 months later, we start looking at the list, and it's like, oh, this guy has the national cover, and this guy has a national cover. It's like, what's going on here? I mean, did you do 2 national covers and one was rejected? About 2 days later, Ron Purcell is set up at a con, and he puts his Lou Fine, early Fox cover on the board. It was done by Joe Simon. Joe Simon watched by and goes, wait a minute, I own that cover. And he takes him to the studio, and there's a Frank Gilly cover. He basically does it. So we basically do a whole bunch of phone calls, and we line up Landis to go to a con and meet some of the people who are training with him because, pick up stuff we wanted. And they sort of convinced him in a not very kind way not to do this anymore. And it took us about, I think, 3 months phone calls to bust Landis. And in the process, I had a package coming in, and I opened it in front of postal inspectors. They got all they verified that it was forgery, at least of the stuff that was coming from the mail. Another guy on the East Coast had been talking to a lawyer, and a bunch of us had called the FBI. So Landis basically pulls out, gives a box back, everything gets returned that was traded. And then, of course, 10 or 12 or 15 years later, there's this news story about Mark Landis having donated all this fine art to different museums across the country. Right? So we cleaned up the comic art thing and drove him into the fine art stuff. And the positive thing was the interesting thing was it took the comic folks about 3 to 4 months to bust him. I think it took the fine art folks about 8 years to figure out who was doing it.
There's actually a documentary.
There is, yeah. There's a documentary about that fine art.
This guy is not like it's a whack job, but it's actually a whack job trying to make money off of it. I mean, this stuff about 20 years ago, no one covered the story. And the final Roger story is, which is rather interesting, is he was having some form of, I think, heart surgery, a major surgery. He was in the hospital when the launching was happening for pre-family death rock cover. And he called from the post-op area.
Tells you all you need to know. That's great. Thanks, George. Anybody else have any comments or Roger stories? We love it. Yes, sir.
I really only knew Roger from the EC group and Facebook and things like that, but my tiny story for the just tiny bit of time I knew him was to show what a good guy he was. I was really interested in looking at old copies of Weird Tales by the artist Matt Fox.
Okay.
And of course he wrote a recent book. And I just happened to see that, that's coming up on Amazon. What a wonderful thing. And I wanted to write an article for it, for a magazine over in England. And so I got in touch with the publisher, and they got me with the designer, and they got in touch with Roger, and we corresponded just a little bit by email. And he said, well, I don't know about doing an interview. And he finally said, well, I'm just about to go into the hospital, so I would like to do an interview, but maybe not. And so, so he took the time to talk to me, even though he was so gravely ill. And it was just, when he never returned my replies, I just happened to see posters all the same. But he was that considerate person that he took time close to his deathbed.
Yeah, I think that was his personality. He was always like that. And, the first time I probably wrote him a letter about some comic artist I was trying to research, I was probably still a teenager, and he got back to me. I never knew him to be sort of impatient with new collectors or anything like that. He would talk to, at least my experience seeing it shows, anybody that walked up to talk to him to ask him a question about EC, whether it was something that he was, particularly interested in, or if it was just a basic question. He kind of had the same demeanor, that great, hey, oh man, you like that? Oh yeah, well, look at this. You got it, amazing, infectious passion, and throughout. Sure, Gary.
Well, back in 2016, I belonged to a bunch of different Facebook groups, and people post images, and sometimes it's really obscure stuff. And I found one that was kind of cool. It was a Alex Toth one-pager advertising for a movie called Circus of Horrors. And so I shared it. I saved the image and I shared it on the CFA app board on Facebook. I'm thinking, I'm just sharing it. Hey, it's kind of cool. I don't know if anybody's going to care. Roger starts emailing me like within a day. What is this? Where did you find it? Where did this come from? I'm like, dude, that one page. Now I'm like, well, I could tell Roger, but in my past experience, sometimes Roger's not always the fastest at getting back to me. So I don't want to have him email me 3 weeks later and find out the piece is long gone.
Right.
So I bought it, and I saved the email conversation here. On another note, the original art to that Toad Circus of Horrors popped up on Mitch's website, and I snapped it up. I'll bring it to Wendy. Holy shit! You got the original art to the Circus of Horrors page by Toad? Can I borrow it while we're at Windy City and I can run to Kinko's and make me a good copy of it? I'll have it back to you within an hour or so. Wow, unbelievable. How much did it cost you through Mitch? I wonder where the hell he got that. I said, yeah, I forgot to grab a scan, but I thought I'd act while I could. I want to see it in person before making any decision, but as I know how much it means to you, because he'd been peppering me with questions just from seeing the image, I'd be open to doing something to put it in its rightful home. And when I brought it to the show, he had an Archie cover, he traded me for it, and he went home happy. Yeah. I'm sure Terry can sound off on whatever happened to it, but anyway, great. That was just a nice little...
Yeah, that's awesome. That's a great story. Sure. Yeah.
How did he come? Oh, there it is. How did he come by the Jack Davis?
The Frankenstein. That's actually a very good question. I don't know the answer to that. Can you
I do.
Yeah. Okay.
So there had been a lot of dumpster diving outside of Warren Publishing when they went bankrupt, and a lot of artwork was just thrown out. And people like Greg Theakston were able to salvage a lot of that. And the Jack Davis Frankenstein was one of the pieces. And it ended up with Rich Halegua. And Rich knew from the very beginning how important that would have been to Roger. And so I don't even know that it was ever even offered to anyone else but Roger. But when he got it, I mean, that was a giant coup for Roger. And I think at the time it might have been one of the most expensive things he ever purchased. And so that's how it came about. And but also, you know, Rich Halegua's name has come up a lot this weekend too. But that was one of the situations with Rich. I don't even think it was about the money then. I think it was about it needed to go to Roger.
Yeah.
So
that was my mic drop.
Terry, thank you so much for being here and letting us give this tribute to Roger.
And for the shirts, in fact.
Yes, thank you for the shirts.
She had these made yesterday. I don't know how she did that.
Nicole, but yeah. Thank you.